Hello everybody and welcome back to the Ultimate Fashion History with me, fashion historian and costume consultant Amanda Hallay, and an episode that I am so excited to share with you, Britain before the Beatles. Now that smart-assed alliteration of the title notwithstanding, I want to be talking about Great Britain between the end of World War II and Kennedy's assassination. That era that we now call the mid-century. Kennedy's assassination is often said to mark the start of the swinging 60s as we know it, and act as the catalyst for the British invasion. And what I want to do in this episode is share with you a theory that I really hold dear and believe in, that the British invasion of the 1960s could not have happened if it wasn't for Britain in the 1950s. Basically, I want to offer up a slightly different interpretation of why England swung in the 60s, as well as disinterring just how cool, fresh, exciting, and innovative Britain in the 50s really was. I think that it's really fun to look at history as a series of revolutions. The Youthquake, for example, that spawned a new kind of living in the 1960s, the Youth Revolution. But in fact, I think that history is more generally made up of evolutions. And so in this episode, I'm going to unpack and explain all of this and hopefully really get you into the flavor, the feel, and hopefully make you fall in love with Britain before the Beatles. As I said in my introduction, the era I'll be discussing in this episode falls roughly between the end of World War II and the assassination of JFK, that atomic age that we very much see as an American era, and quite rightly in so many ways. It was the era when the United States of America sent rockets into space, forging a celestial new frontier in the stars. It was the era when America pioneered exciting new and utterly modern visions in architecture, when the American home became light and airy and spacious, when the American lifestyle became one of increased leisure with these gadget-filled homes and split-level ranch-style dwellings. In the USA, it was the age of the automobile, many Americans experiencing a newfound mobility, driving towards a shiny new American dream, propelled by an explosion in consumerism. In the arts, abstract expressionism placed America as a prime player on the international modernist art scene, while at the movies the exciting new experience of VistaVision and Panavision did its best to pull people away from television. This decades-old technology finally made it into the average American home in the post-war era, reorienting both the living room and the way that time was partitioned. Shows like I Love Lucy, The Honeymooners, Leave It to Beaver, Dragnet, Perry Mason, and The Ed Sullivan Show, now considered benchmarks in the history of entertainment, while American bandstands celebrated that brand new youth-targeted music that was an utterly American invention. Rock and roll, this exciting new sound that erupted in America's mid-century, born of blues and jazz and ragtime and all the other all-American musical moments that made up the century, giving the world a new sort of star. From Elvis Presley to Buddy Holly, Little Richard to Chuck Berry, rock and roll infused the world with a youthful electricity that immediately forged a generation gap that would absolutely mark the following decade. More sophisticated sounds could be found in the realm of the new expressive jazz, made by exciting new talents like Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, and John Coltrane. Korea and the Cold War notwithstanding, with its rockets into space and a smile on every face, at least that's what Madison Avenue would have us believe, I think that, true or false, America in the 50s and early 60s is seen as the colourful flagship of the post-war era. Yet when it came to fashion, Vive la France et vive la révolution de Christian Dior. When Dior launched his new look in 1947, he truly drew a line under what had just gone before. And although the new look looked back to an idealized romantic female form, it looked to the future in terms of redefining the female silhouette throughout the era we're discussing. Imitated throughout the world, it was Paris that set fashion's tone. But post-war Paris also became the intellectual center of the universe. Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialist philosophy embraced by the true intelligentsia and the highly pretentious alike, and inspired America's incredibly affected beatnik movement. And for pure, unadulterated cool, post-war Italy was perceived as the pinnacle of cool, with its own sharp take on modernist design, its Vespers, Fellini, people around the world wanting a slice of this stylish Dolce Vita and take a Roman holiday, if only in their minds. But where was Britain in all this? Well, here it is. At least this is how history tends to remember Britain in the post-war era. Still living in the rubble of the Blitz, a nation so badly impacted by World War II that there was no chance it could actually do anything interesting in the 50s other than rebuild and survive. A nation still operating under the ration, which was only entirely lifted in 1954, almost a decade after VE Day. The British still queuing up for their miserable margarine and rationed rasher of bacon. Nothing to do but huddle around their wirelesses, eating their fish and chips. But not to worry, love, because we'd eventually get to the mid-1960s when the Beatles and Twiggy and Carnaby Street and a legion of very young people would come along and save the day, putting Britain back on the cultural map and making it the center of the universe. Swinging England would define pop culture for the second half of the 1960s, everything from fashion to film to music driven by a youthquake that rocked the world. And yes, this is absolutely true, but I am of the very strong opinion that the cultural success of Britain in the 1960s could not have happened had it not been for what happened in Great Britain in the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s. Post-war Britain laying the foundation for the swinging England of the mid-1960s, and far from being somehow left behind, it was every bit as technologically advanced and culturally exciting as any other nation, not only rivaling, but in some areas forging way ahead of its transatlantic or continental cousins, starting with that post-war sense of optimism. In 1952, Britain got a new queen, and they crowned her in 1953, and this was seen as a true fresh start, Elizabeth's youth seeming to set the tone for the coming decade, her coronation propelling Great Britain into the television age. With so many Britons buying their first TV set specifically to watch the coronation, TV ownership in Britain jumped from 350,000 in 1950 to 3.2 million. In 1959, almost 86% of American households owned a television, which is an enormous number, but it may surprise you to learn that by 1960, Britain was neck and neck with a whopping 80% of households tuning in every evening to their favourite shows. And why is television so important? Because it communicates ideas, and ideas were circulating very quickly in this Britain before the Beatles. Its first motorways opened in Britain, the Preston Bypass in 1958 and the mighty M1 in 1959, drastically reducing the time it took to traverse the nation, coinciding perfectly with the rise in automobile manufacture and ownership in post-war Britain. And this leap in car ownership saw Britain produce its most iconic cars in this era, the Morris Minor in 1948 and the first Mini in 1959, compact cars for a compact country, but a country on the move and driving into an optimistic future. America may have gone big with technology blasting out of the stratosphere and into the infinity of space, but Britain went small, very small. When Maurice Wilkes invented computer microprogramming and storage, and so I couldn't be doing this, and you couldn't be watching it, if it wasn't for the enormous interest and investment in computer technology that drove the UK in the post-war era. In fact, the secret of life itself was discovered in this Britain before the Beatles. When Watson and Crick's discovered the double helix, those curling carbons that make us who we are, and although Watson was American, and now disgraced, and quite rightly, for using his research to spout unfounded racist theories, the discovery of the double helix in 1953 happened in Britain and speaks to just how advanced the nation was in the scientific sphere in the post-war era. And sure, Britain sent no one into space in the 50s. But it went to the highest point on this planet when, on the eve of the Queen's coronation, Edmund Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing were the first men ever to reach the top of Mount Everest. And certainly Hillary was a New Zealander, but New Zealand is part of the Commonwealth, and Britain was very quick to claim this conquest as its own. It's no wonder that this period is known as the New Elizabethan Age. Britain in the post-war years noted for both innovation in the sciences and exploration, but also for its rapid social change. In 1948, Britain launched its National Health Service, the NHS, which fans of Call the Midwife will know all about. Its government-funded healthcare service, which, for the first time ever, allowed all Britons the right to medical and dental care, the introduction of the NHS increasing life expectancy. And this revolution in British healthcare was, in part, facilitated by the nurses and doctors who arrived from the Caribbean to post-war Britain, specifically to help rebuild the nation and propel it into a better future. The first wave of the Windrush generation arrived in 1948, brought to Britain on promises of a better life, promises wrapped in a flimsy package of patriotic rhetoric. And although the Windrush generation were never given what was promised, they gave to Great Britain not only their hard work in rebuilding the nation's infrastructure, but they infused Great Britain with a new kind of electricity, with a new kind of music, a new kind of style, a new way of life. And the same is true for the Indian, Pakistan, Bengal and Sri Lankan immigrants to Britain in the post-war era, all contributing to the rebuilding of Britain and turning the nation into a truly multicultural one. Now, I am not saying that they didn't face the same kind of racism as found in the United States. And although segregation wasn't illegal in Britain until 1964, it wasn't legal either, as it was in a great many of the United States, remaining Jim Crow laws not overturned until the mid-1960s. And in an era when, in America, interracial marriage was forbidden by law in 31 US states. In Britain in 1958, singer Cleo Lane married jazzman Johnny Dankworth, and this was heralded in the press as a romantic piece of showbiz news to be celebrated. But celebrations were already in full swing at the start of the decade, in 1951, with the Festival of Britain. Yes, America had Eames and that exciting new style of mid-century modernism with plastics and formica and bold and happy colours. But the Festival of Britain showcased that Britain too was riding the modernist horse. This showcase of British design with space-age architecture and brightly coloured forms and shapes never before seen. Does this look like the product of a bombed-out backwater? Look at these incredible structures. And when it came to the interior design proposed by the Festival of Britain, the sleek, clean and crisp new shapes rivaled anything found in the American or Danish mid-century design, with furniture and lighting that spoke to an international need to draw a line in the sand after World War II and truly embrace a brave new world. Now, in terms of architecture, yes, America gave the world the international modern style, those gleaming glass skyscrapers that owed nothing to any nation or culture that went before, as well as the beloved Googie architecture, structures that look culled from the Jetsons, ready for a world to conquer outer space. But Britain had its own thoughts about modernist architecture and certainly threw its own hat into the ring of architecture in the post-war era. With brutalism. Brutalist architecture is British. Now, I know this doesn't look particularly brutalist, but Smithton High School, designed by Alison and Peter Smithson and opened in 1954, is considered the first piece of brutalist architecture. Its fuss-free lines absolutely revolutionary on the British architectural landscape. The new Coventry Cathedral by Basil Spence laid its foundation stone in 1954. The work completed in 1963, its exciting use of modern shapes, proving that houses of worship need not follow medieval theologic tenets in terms of architecture. Its apse full of space and light, its modernist intent completed with a tapestry by Graham Sutherland. The Central Parade in North London took the spatial dimensions of Quattrocento architecture and turned it into a brutalist wonder. All around the country, this new and bold architecture was transforming urban living and changing the landscape forever. Entire new towns appeared in this Britain before the Beatles, like Basildon here, with its wide, carless thoroughfares and modernist murals. And the working-class British, forced for decades to live in cramped domestic architecture of the Victorian era, many still without indoor plumbing, were offered a new kind of architecture that offered room to breathe, more room to live. The first supermarket opened in a Britain before the Beatles in 1951 and was instantly joined by thousands of others. It's no wonder that Prime Minister Harold Macmillan told the British people they'd never had it so good, although judging by this picture, he had yet to avail himself of the National Health Dental Service. Let's look at art in a Britain before the Beatles. Although we may all think of pop art as quintessentially American, with its Warhols and its Lichtensteins and its Jasper Johns, but pop art is a British invention. Edoardo Paolozzi's Meet the People is from 1948 and arguably the first piece of proper pop art. Hamilton, Peter Blake, all of them Brits, and all pop artists. In fact, the term pop art was coined in 1954 by art critic Lawrence Alloway in relation to this new wave of British art. And yes, Lawrence Alloway was British too. Let's look at lit. Of course, this was a particularly exciting time for American literature, the Beat generation and others revolutionizing what it meant to write, with extraordinary new talents like Neil Cassidy, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs. But guess what? Britain before the Beatles matched America's new generation of literary genius, with incredible new writers like Harold Pinter, John Osborne, John Brain, these angry young men who wrote to and for a different kind of Britain, and when applied to the stage, British theatre of the post-war era was eclectic and electric and exciting. It utterly eschewed the upper-class drawing-room dramas or witty posh repartee associated with British theatre, instead focusing on the gritty realism of the working classes and the disenfranchised. Sometimes these angry young men were joined by angry young women. Writer Sheila Delaney was only 19 years old when she wrote her seminal kitchen sink drama, A Taste of Honey, that featured interracial romance, teenage pregnancy, and a very sympathetic view of homosexuality, the play going forth to help relax Britain's laws regarding the depiction of homosexuality on screen and stage. Turned into what is now a classic movie, A Taste of Honey showed international audiences a far grittier side of Britain, as did the other so-called kitchen sink dramas of the era, Room at the Top, The Loneliness of a Long-Distance Runner, The L-Shaped Room, A Kind of Loving, Britain's unique take on cinéma vérité, rivaling the French Nouvelle Vague and a far cry from the glossy VistaVision offerings of Hollywood. Yet America was moving forward with a new breed of actors, Marlon Brando, James Dean and Montgomery Clift, all of whom redefined the role of movie star with their earthy portrayals of troubled men, but Britain had its own breed of mould-breaking actors in this era. Alan Bates, Tom Courtenay, Richard Harris, Oliver Reed, Lawrence Harvey, Albert Finney, Robert Shaw, and although Richard Burton was Welsh, he sharpened his teeth on the English stage. All of these talented men not looking or acting like movie stars of the past. And speaking of movie stars, yes, America had Marilyn Monroe and Jane Mansfield, and France had Brigitte Bardot, and Italy had Sophia Loren. But Britain before the Beatles had Diana Dors. Repeat, Britain had Diana Dors. Oh, she was wonderful. Another genre of movie came by way of Ealing Studios, which of course had been around for decades, but it was the Ealing comedies of the post-war era for which the studio is most famed. Kind Hearts and Coronets, The Lavender Hill Mob, and of course The Lady Killers, seen as genuinely subversive in theme, and other new British comedy came by way of The Goons with the young Peter Sellers, Tony Hancock, and of course the Carry On movies. 1958 saw the first of the Carry On movies, and even if the slapstick humour and endless innuendo of movies like Carry On Sergeant, Carry On Nurse and Carry On Constable are not to your taste, I will give the Carry On franchise this. It featured actors like Charles Hawtrey and the inimitable Kenneth Williams. And although neither of these men could come out publicly as gay, homosexuality still being illegal in Britain, it was no secret that they were, and yet they were embraced as part of the show business establishment in this Britain before the Beatles. And although horribly sexist, embarrassingly so, the sheer amount of skin on display and sexual innuendo in the Carry On movies was extraordinary for mainstream movies of the 1950s and speaks to a growing sense of sexual liberation in Great Britain that far predates the free love spirit of swinging London. After all, this was the era of the Profumo affair, the whole world discovering that far from being prudish and uptight, those Brits certainly knew how to let their hair down in the bedroom department. Sticking with the movies, the first Hammer horror movie came out in 1955, kind of a genre unto itself. And the first was followed by so many more. Hammer arguably inventing the gory horror movie franchise concept decades before Freddy or Jason or Michael Myers. And when it came to the small screen, yes, America had fabulous TV shows like I Love Lucy, Leave It to Beaver and The Ed Sullivan Show, but fans of Dancing with the Stars might be interested to learn that the show had its roots on British TV, with Come Dancing, which debuted in 1949. The BBC brought live theatre into everybody's homes with the Sunday night play, And it is argued that the first example of fashion TV came from Britain before the Beatles with Your Wardrobe. But perhaps the most notable example of British television of this era comes by way of Coronation Street, that is still running. The evening soap that brought gritty kitchen sink vibes into the nicest of homes. Viewers glued to the day-to-day dramas of folk up north. And fashion fans are sure to know this one. The Avengers debuted almost 2 years before the Beatles' first single. And sticking with music, Britain's musical theatre finally got its international recognition with the original West End production of Oliver. It was really considered a very hip and new and exciting way to present a musical on stage. I'll admit that when it came to rock and roll, British rockers were modelled as imitations of Elvis Presley, but not pale imitations. I'd argue that the records of Cliff Richard, Billy Fury, Shane Fenton, and many others have a sweet, slightly melancholic flavour all of their own. But hold on, when it came to the technology of music, Britain before the Beatles may have actually ruled the world. Thanks to this man, the utterly bonkers but equally brilliant Joe Meek, who invented sampling when the Sugar Hill Gang was still but twinkles in their father's eyes. Often recording hit singles from his flat above a luggage shop in London, Joe Meek created imaginative recording techniques he'd apply to very odd but completely engaging pop songs. Ask anyone on the street what the first Billboard #1 pop record by a British artist in the US was, and 10 to 1 they'll say Love Me Do or Can't Buy Me Love. But Joe Meek pitted the Beatles to the post with 1960s Telstar by the Tornadoes, a space-age marvel that just never gets old. Sadly, Joe Meek came to a sad end by way of murder-suicide. He did the murder and then he did the suicide, but I think he'd have loved this headline, and being described simply as Pop Man. So sure, Britain before the Beatles had its Elvis imitators, its skiffle, but it also had the incredible Joe Meek. And musicians like John Barry and his John Barry 7 created an entirely new subgenre of music, mixing jazz with pop and creating a sound that appealed to everyone. John Barry writing the theme for someone else who made their mark in a Britain before the Beatles. James Bond. James Bond was a creation of a Britain before the Beatles. Ian Fleming's first Bond novel, Casino Royale, published in 1953, and the first Bond movie, Dr. No, came out in 1962. The whole 007 universe is a product of Britain before the Beatles and not a product of swinging England. And now, of course, we have to talk about fashion. Of course, Britain had its posh couturiers in the Dior mode, like Norman Hartnell and Hardy Amis, but look who else was making her name in a Britain before the Beatles. Mary Quant. This is a Mary Quant cocktail dress from 1959. Look how short it is and how she's marrying the fullness of the new look skirt with a burgeoning idea for the mini. Yet Mary was already a really hot name on the London fashion scene well before the swinging 60s. She and future husband Alexander Plunkett Green opening the first of her bazaar boutiques in 1955, almost a decade before the Beatles appeared at Shea Stadium. And in the realm of teenage street fashion, Britain before the Beatles rivaled any nation in the world. With its outrageously dressed and uber-trendy teddy boys, with their Edwardian-inspired clothing, brothel creeper shoes, their bolo ties and statement quiffs. And as for teddy girls, oh my goodness, with their strange throwback fashions mixed with menswear, they were arguably as shocking as the original punk rockers 20 years later. And in the late 1950s, the first mods would appear. Those boys sharply dressed in Savile Row suits and Ben Sherman shirts, fans of modern jazz, hence their nickname, the Mods. Their girlfriends dressed in sharp Italian-inspired clothing. Mod would become the catch-all word for everything cool, hip, fashionable, and especially British in the 1960s, but the original mods came out of Soho, London in the 1950s. Know what else was a product of Britain before the Beatles? The Beatles were a product of Britain before the Beatles. John and Paul first meeting and making music in 1957, and in a nation that was already teeming with youth and creativity and energy and new ideas, a nation that was ready for them. Because far from being a miserable, bombed-out nation reeling from war, the Britain before the Beatles was a petri dish, already germinating so many of the things we associate with swinging London, and from which the British invasion of the 60s would grow. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode here on The Ultimate Fashion History with me, Amanda Hallay, and I hope I did a pretty convincing job, I like to think I did, of setting forth swinging England and the swinging 60s in general. Not so much a story of revolution, but one of evolution. Anyway, please write in and tell me what you think, or better yet, why don't you chat about it with the rest of us on the Ultimate Fashion History Facebook group? I'll leave a link to all of these things. I don't do comments here, but I will leave a link to my personal contact details as well. If you are into fiction, vintage books, join the Dean Street Press Facebook group. That's our publishing company. I will be back very soon with more on the Ultimate Fashion History. Until then, thank you ever so much for watching. Take care. Bye for now.